This week, we welcome Loris Degioanni from Sysdig to discuss their open source container native runtime security project called Falco. In the news segment, the Matrix turns 20. Containers are weakest security link again. The evolution of application security in the serverless world, and more. Stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies, protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week. Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences patented technology protects any application against any attack, with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences, demand more from your WAF. Learn more at signalsciences.com/PSW.
Welcome to Application Security Weekly. This is episode number 56, recorded April 8th, 2019. I am your new co-host, Matt Alderman, replacing Paul Asadorian. Now, don't worry, Paul's not going anywhere. We just decided to split up the focus a little bit. He's going to stay focused on Hack Naked News, Enterprise Security Weekly, and Paul's Security Weekly. I'm going to focus more on Application Security Weekly and Business Security Weekly, which means we have a new host for Application Security. So I would like to introduce Mike Shima, who is going to replace Keith Hoodlet as our primary host.
Hey there, Matt. This is Mike, and it's good to see you again. And I had a great time chatting with you and Paul and Keith last episode, and looking forward to having a lot more talks like that and talking a lot more about application and security.
Yeah, I mean, we brought you on as Keith's last show, and part of that was to kind of get a feel for how comfortable you were coming over. We really wanted to bring in somebody from the application security community to take over for Keith as our primary host. So welcome aboard.
Yeah, thanks again. And my background, I've done the gamut of consulting, then automating consulting and actually writing code to break stuff, and then working on the enterprise side of thing and not being the vendor. So hopefully some of that comes through over these conversations over the next several weeks, because I think there's a lot of interesting and fun stuff we can do and talk about with AppSec.
Yeah, I agree. We're also adding a new co-host. So John Kinsella is going to join us as a new co-host on Application Security Weekly. Welcome, John.
Thank you, sir. Good to meet you guys again. It's going to be fun to see how the three of us sort of get along. I've got that same background between consulting, development, operations, and I'm actually now on the vendor side, right? So we'll see if we can have some balance between us and the conversations.
Yeah,
Fun.
John and I work together at Layered Insight, and John's got great experience. We're trying to move the show formats, all of them actually, by the way, across the network, is primary hosts and at least two guest co-hosts. That'll mirror more of what we're doing with Paul's Security Weekly, and it allows a little more coverage. If Mike's out or I'm out or John's out, we still have at least two primary hosts and co-hosts that you're used to hearing on a regular basis, and kind of helps us all out at the end. All right. Too many alerts and not enough action? It's time to get SaltStack. SaltStack is an intelligent IT automation platform that detects security issues in critical business systems and then actually fixes them. With SaltStack, security and IT teams work together to define custom security policies with certified checks for CIS, disastigs, and more, scan systems for millions of compliance checks in minutes, remediate compliance, vulnerability issues with powerful automation, all from a single platform. Visit securityweekly.com/SaltStack to learn more. Also, register for our upcoming webcast with ServiceNow by going to securityweekly.com/webcasts. Also, if you've missed any of our previously recorded webcasts, you can always find them at securityweekly.com/on-demand. And finally, are you attending KubeCon and Cloud Native Con Europe 2019 in Barcelona, May 20th to 23rd, 2019? Join your peers at the Cloud Native Transformation Summit 2019, hosted by Sysdig on May 20th. I will be emceeing the event, and pre-registration is required. You can add a co-located event on to your KubeCon and Cloud Native registration by going out to their website. All right, let's get to our guests. We are Sysdig heavy today. Loris Degioanni is the CTO and founder of Sysdig. Loris is also the creator of the popular open source troubleshooting tool Sysdig and the open source container security tool Falco. Prior to founding Sysdig, Loris co-created Wireshark, the open source network analyzer, which today has 20 plus million users. Loris holds a PhD in computer engineering from Politecnico di Torino. Buongiorno, Loris. Welcome to Application Security Weekly.
Buongiorno. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you. You and I had a briefing at RSA conference. I came over to the Sysdig office, and your background in Wireshark obviously intrigued me, but also what you've done for the community with the open source projects under Sysdig. And I said, well, let's get Loris on. Let's talk about these open source tools that people can leverage today to deal with I think, two very challenging problems in the container side, right? How do you monitor containers in this new world of application development, but also then how do you secure these containers? So give us a little history and background on kind of how did you move into Sysdig in some of these open source tools?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you were mentioning, I come from packets. And before starting the Sysdig adventure, I spent pretty much the previous decade and a half working with packets at different levels, and in particular, doing packet capture with Win Pickup initially, and then becoming a contributor for Wireshark. So I was one of the people that contributed creating the workflows that people maybe are familiar with when dealing with, like network traffic and network troubleshooting and network security. In particular, being able to maybe connect to the spam port of a router and collect packets flowing on the network. And then with packets, you can do a lot of stuff because packets have the property of being very dense in information and very rich and very deep in terms of what you can do with them, but at the same time being pretty like horizontal to capture, right? So in the packet world, we used to say packets never lie, right? And after essentially starting my first company, Case Technologies, the company behind the Wireshark, the popular network analyzer. That company was acquired, and when deciding what to do next in my career, I realized that what we were doing with computer networks, despite being very powerful and very important, was going to be architecturally very challenging in modern infrastructures. Why? Because when dealing with cloud instances, for example, on AWS, on other clouds, or when dealing with containers, and especially orchestrated containers, where you can have hundreds of them on a single machine, there's a lot that is going on without really having the opportunity to see stuff at the network level. Where's the network tap? Where's the router spam port, when you're operating on the cloud or when you're dealing with containers? So I was inspired to start something that would have the same properties, the same workflows, but at the same time would work in the modern world of cloud native infrastructures. And with Sysdig, I essentially started exploring from the technological point of view the ability to tap into running applications by sitting at the operating system level by essentially leveraging facilities like eBPF in the Linux kernel, and leverage these essentially to being able to see what's happening inside every process, every container, every application. And this was developed, again, a bit like with Wireshark, with an open core mentality and open source first. And so we started releasing initially, in 2014, an open source troubleshooting tool called Sysdig, which then gave the name to the company. And this is very much sort of like TCP dump for your applications and for your containers. And then that evolved into Falco, which we released in 2017. And Falco is now part of CNCF as a sandbox project. And I very often compare Falco to like Snort or Suricata for your containers and for your system calls. So the data source is like signals coming from the operating system, for example, system calls. So every time a file is accessed or read or written, that generates a system call. Every time a network connection is established or there's data going through the network, that's a system call. So there's this very rich data set. And Falco is a rule system sitting on the stream of system calls so that you can create a rule, for example, I don't know, notify me when somebody spawns a shell in a Redis container and then does a curl, or notify me when specific sensitive files are accessed and let me know what exactly was read or written on these files. Or network connections and stuff like that, right? So there's this very rich domain-specific language that allows you essentially to create rules, and then Falco manages essentially the plumbing of these rules and being able to collect this data from multiple machines and generates essentially events based on these rules. All of these essentially is part of like a family of tools that Sysdig offers to the community, which is packaged in a way to be, well, very friendly for the community, based, on Apache licenses, and also available for different use cases, exactly like Wireshark was, so troubleshooting, security, runtime detection, forensics, and so on. So that's, like a bit of how Sysdig got here, what we offer, and a little bit of, overview.
Now, from a architectural perspective, I think you're tapping in at the Falco tool connects in at the kernel level. Does it support both Linux and Windows hosts, or is it just very focused on the Linux side of containers?
Currently, we focus more on the Linux side, mostly because as you can probably imagine, containers for Linux are a little bit more advanced in the terms of maturity, and a lot of the action, like with Kubernetes and Docker and so on, happens on the Linux side. So Sysdig, especially with regards to like the deep kernel level instrumentation, focuses a little bit more on the Linux side and takes advantage of facilities like I was mentioning before, eBPF, that are specific for Linux. But of course, we are working on supporting Windows in a much more complete and deep way.
Got it. And then would that also be an open source capability then also distributed out with Falco? Would it just be a different version of Falco then at that point?
Yeah, for us, so architecture, essentially Falco is, again, a bit like Wireshark can run on any platform. And then essentially what happens is the packet capture part of Wireshark, which is the one that actually talks to the network and talks to the operating system, that's specific for every single operating system. Very similarly, Sysdig and Falco have been architectured in a way that essentially there's a layer of capture, and everything else on top of that is system independent and can run on any system.
Got it. John, I know you've got some questions sitting there somewhere.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, I'll say first, full disclosure, I'm a competitor in a way, so I'm going to keep my questions polite and non-pointed. But first, what I really want to say, Loris, is thank you for all the work you've done with Wireshark over the years, and also Sysdig now too. There's so many countless numbers of us who've either used it in professional situations or security situations, or showing people, on the network side that, hey, we actually have a problem on the net. And so it's a great tool. It's thank you for all of that. I guess the first question for me, just talking about the Windows support. Are you guys seeing any interest around ARM or other architectures? Are you thinking about IoT, or where do you, from where you guys are sitting, where do you think about containers over the next few years?
Yeah, for sure. As Sysdig, we've been exposed to the container revolution essentially since the very early days. So we've been exposed to many use cases for containers, and definitely, as you can easily imagine from the architectural point of view, containers are really very well suited for IoT kind of use cases, just because as elements of packaging, they tend to be very isolated, very portable, and also very small, which are all features that are very welcome in IoT situations. So ARM for sure. Let's say probably from the point of view of ARM, I've seen use cases that range from stuff like running, Docker and containerization on something like, wind turbines and industrial kind of level IoT to airplanes and, stuff that maybe flies and needs to be, isolated and packaged in a container to many different use cases. So let's say, for sure, we hear about containers a lot in enterprise and IT use cases, especially related to cloud native computing and cloud in a general way. But there are many use cases in IoT, and definitely ARM is the platform there.
Cool. I'm not sure how many of our listeners or viewers have a really solid understanding about CNCF. So also congratulations on getting Falco in there. But it might be interesting to talk for, 30 seconds. How has that experience been for you guys? What is it like working with CNCF? How has that helped the project once you guys came in there? What's your thoughts around that? Has been so far?
Yeah, sure. To start maybe with a little bit of a context, CNCF is a cloud native computing foundation. So, we can, by oversimplifying quite a bit, but maybe call it the Apache Foundation for modern software, right? CNCF is specifically focused on being the home for software that is specifically designed for modern environments and to support the modern cloud/containerized workloads. So Kubernetes is probably the best known, project hosted by CNCF, but many other projects, for example, Prometheus, or for example, Sysdig Falco, which is in sandbox phase there, are part of this foundation. We, as Sysdig, decided to have Falco become part of CNCF because there's a strong, ecosystem component in what we do, and there's a strong value that the ecosystem can bring to Falco to make Falco better. And CNCF from the ecosystem point of view is really the place to be. So by being part of the CNCF, we are exposed essentially to users that match very well the use cases that Falco offers. In particular, Falco is very tightly integrated with Kubernetes and with many other cloud native tools in terms of functionality. So the place where we really shine in Falco in terms of being able to bring value to the users is cloud and Kubernetes specifically. For example, we're integrated in many different places to the Kubernetes API so that Falco is able to make the user create rules that are service oriented, right? So you can specify, instead of just specifying the name of a container or the name of a machine for a rule, you can specify a service, or you can specify a cluster or a namespace, all of this kind of stuff. So for us, being integrated closely there and being part of those conversations is very important. Also, CNCF acts as a support for like marketing, for events, for helping us, for example, to get all of our tools get like security scans and making sure that we're in a good shape from the security point of view. We participate to KubeCon. We have speaking slots there, so we can bring our tool in front of the community and get feedback from the community. So overall, it's just an extremely positive experience, and that is paired with mentorship from CNCF people that have a lot of experience in this space. So it's a huge benefit for us as an open source tool. And of course, we try to convert those benefits into making the tool better and better for the community.
That's great. Mike, I want to let you get in here if you got a couple questions before I ask another one to Loris.
Yeah, I wanted to tackle it from the aspect of deploying and using it. So I think it's fantastic to be able to instrument anything. In other words, let's gather some information. And Loris, I think you mentioned too, like a shell launches curl, and we can also imagine scenarios like a shell launches netcat. It's great to have access to data, but what about getting into filtering it? So Wireshark, and kudos for that work too. Wireshark has a great amount of filtering. What would be a good, what might be some good filters that you would recommend, or what would be like your top one or two approaches in order to gather some high signal security information out of something like Falco?
Yes. So as I was mentioning, our whole Sysdig stack is heavily inspired by Wireshark. So if I had to describe, in a very condensed way, what Sysdig and Falco are, is really like Wireshark for your system calls, right? So we take system calls and other system events, and we convert them in sort of a stream that can be treated in a way very similar to packets. So with Sysdig, you have, for example, the -w flag on the command line tool, exactly like in TCP dump or in Wireshark, that you can use to create a trace file. And guess what? A trace file containing system calls generated by Sysdig is a pickup file, because among other things, I was the guy who originally defined the pickup ng file format, which is the one that is used by Wireshark and all of the other tools, right? So typically, when you take a trace file with TCP dump or Wireshark or anything else, you save the packets in a format that is a format that I was one of the original contributors to define this format, right? So it was very natural for me when starting working on Sysdig and our set of open source tools to just, okay, let's use the same format, especially because pickup ng is designed to be extensible and to store, anything that can be like packetized, so subdivided in units, that contain a little bit of the whole piece of information. So the first thing is, from the architectural point of view, when you use Sysdig, you can do something pretty much what you can do, with Wireshark or with TCP dump. And the first thing that I always recommend is take captures, and with Falco as well, as a consequence maybe of a Falco alert, just taking a capture is a very, very good way to get an insight and being able to do further investigation. So taking a capture as a consequence of a Falco alert then allows you to go and really see exactly, on a process by process, thread by thread, file by file, connection by connection level, what's happening, right? So there are many filters that you can use in Sysdig to essentially go deeper into the information. I recommend to just from the command line to type sysdig-shell, and this gives you a long list of stuff that you can do. From the logical point of view, the Sysdig filtering system works logically very similar to the Wireshark one. So you have fields, and you can combine them in Boolean like expressions, right? So if with Wireshark you can do like port 80 and TCP SYN flag equal true. In Sysdig you can do stuff like file name contains /etc and process name is whatever Apache, something like that. If you want to get only the events that show you Apache file activity in /etc. So there are categories of filters that cover, for example, network, file I/O, interprocess communication, like for example, I/O on pipes, user activity, because there are specific system calls, for example, execv, that give you information about every time a process is executed, right? So I recommend to familiarize with the high-level categories to understand at the high level what you can do with Sysdig, which is much more than what you can do with TCP dump and Wireshark. Of course, there's network, of course, there's file, and so on. And then from there, use Sysdig the shell to investigate which fields you can use and how you can combine them to do something a bit more sophisticated. One other thing that I want to mention is we offer another open source tool, which is called Sysdig Inspect. Sysdig Inspect is more like a visual user interface that allows you to dive into these system call based captures in a way that is much more like graphical and intuitive. So with Sysdig Inspect, I wanted to sort of be inspired by the Wireshark user interface for packets, but also bring it maybe at a slightly higher level, so that you have like a nice overview page when you get in the tool, and you can see what's happening, and then use these tiles to like drill down into, for example, network activity versus maybe executed commands or stuff like that. And the Sysdig Inspect is a tool that can be downloaded. You just go on our GitHub pages, and can be installed on your Mac, on your PC, on your Linux laptop or workstation. And especially if you're new to the Sysdig family of tools, is a great way to start.
That's great. Mike, did you have anything else? Because I have one interesting question for Loris.
Yeah, dive into the interesting question, and maybe is there some follow-up I can dive on?
Yeah. So Loris, I'm interested to understand, as we move more of these container workloads into Amazon and Google and Azure, and we abstract out more of the underlying capabilities, the orchestrator, Kubernetes itself, or moving directly into something like a Fargate, right, where you're completely kind of in this new serverless environment. That I think that creates more limitations than maybe what Falco can do today. How are you thinking about that same level of visibility as we move these container environments into more abstracted infrastructure layers like serverless? How does that impact where Falco and some of these other open source tools go?
Yeah, to me, first of all, I 100% agree with the trend, and I see more and more adoption for, function as a service infrastructures, like, for example, Lambda. And I see more and more people that prefer to delegate the complexity of manage a container-based, orchestrated, maybe Kubernetes-based environment, delegate these complexities to somebody like a cloud vendor that can manage it for you. So for sure, in the future, I see, let's say, more and more computing consumed with abstractions that become higher and higher, right? At the same time, I also strongly believe that the issues of visibility, the issues of detecting, intrusion and data exfiltration, and detecting, networking issues and application issues, these remain, and if possible, become even more important, because now you don't have control on the infrastructure. So essentially, you need to trust your provider. So understanding that things are working properly and are working securely are becoming more and more important. From the Sysdig point of view, of course, we strive to continue to support these workloads as they essentially move toward the cloud and move to more like managed ways to consume them. And there are, many ways we are moving toward the direction. I consider essentially like our duty and sort of a little bit of an implementation detail how we do this. But the mission of Sysdig, or what we call the Sysdig way, still wants to give people, like the best data with the best possible granularity to solve these kind of problems. To give you some examples of stuff that we're working on, we're paying, very close attention and starting working on stuff like, for example, Firecracker from Amazon and other, micro VMs that are then used, to like execute these kind of workloads, like Lambda or Fargate, and see. We're exploring how Sysdig can plug into these micro VMs to offer the kind of granularity that we want to offer to troubleshoot and secure these workloads. And similarly, we're looking at what kind of these cloud vendors offer in terms of integration, both for high level information and metrics consumption, and more like a deeper level integration for granular information and capture like data extraction. So there's quite a bit going on in the community and in Sysdig specifically to try to work with these technologies.
Yeah, could you see like the cloud providers leveraging things like Sysdig and Falco and the open source projects to kind of embed in and then make that data available as part of the overall service? Do you see that as a possible trend? I'm just because I think for commercial vendors, sorry, John, not that much for John, but I could see for some commercial vendors when you move into serverless and there's no host anymore or some of these environments, then if some of these open source tools were embedded in, then at least I could still get that visibility, but then I'd have to probably consolidate that into some other enterprise solution potentially to kind of correlate across those different environments to really manage the container security more holistically. Are you seeing adoption of some of these open source projects by the cloud providers? Because I could see that as a way to make it easier to consume some of the data you provide.
Look, the main reason why we started Sysdig with an open source approach is exactly this. Especially if you look at the security landscape, that's a landscape where open source is, there are examples, but it's still not that widespread. For example, even there are several security vendors for containers and microservices, but still not a huge amount of open source. The reason why Sysdig decided to go open source first and invest a lot on open source to the point that all of our core technology is essentially open source is exactly because we saw an opportunity not only to create a community in terms of final users, but also to stimulate, community adoption from vendors and in particular, from cloud platforms. Definitely, I strongly believe that there's a little bit of a vacuum in terms of cloud platforms, in terms of deeper troubleshooting, forensics level kind of information. Clouds all have their own sort of monitoring systems, and they give you metrics for their services and the kind of stuff. And those are great, to understand that the green light versus the red light level, what's going on. But very often you need more than that, right? So Sysdig fills the gap, and that gap requires a deeper insight. And the deeper insight is much better if the cloud provider can offer that, And we're starting seeing, for sure, I cannot speak for cloud providers. I don't have, I'm not able to do that. But we're seeing positive signs in terms of adoption. We're still starting seeing Kubernetes distributions that are starting embedding, technologies like Sysdig and Falco, and even in terms of cloud providers, definitely there are some very positive conversations there.
Very good. John, Mike, any additional questions for Loris?
Yeah, well, I know Mike had another, so how about it?
I was going to dive into that aspect of like the deployment. So some of the what are some of the use cases you see here? For example, I can imagine ImageMagick, notorious in the past for having some rough edges in terms of image just resizing, exploits. So it's great to be able to sandbox something and as well as get insight into it. So how would you kind of position this in relation to sandboxing a container with some really strong setcomp BPF, things like that, versus what can be filtered and what signals this can get from hooking syscalls?
Yeah, the sandboxing problem is always a problem that fascinated me a lot, because from one point of view, it's the holy grail, right? Because being able to specifically restrict the activity of an application component, and containers are perfect for that, and let this application component do only the bare minimum to perform its role and nothing else, is really the best hope that we have to protect ourselves and our applications from zero-day attacks, because it's wonderful to be completely up to date, with like CVEs and making sure that our software is not vulnerable and make sure that it's scanned frequently. But honestly, for each CVE that we see, how many attacks, how many 0 days are there around that can compromise our security, right? So the sandboxing is has a lot of potential. At the same time, the other thing that is very true is that there's no sandboxing without excellent visibility, right? Because I don't know what's the real degree of sandboxing that, for example, you should use with seccomp or SE Linux with, again, your whatever Apache container, with your nginx, with your Redis, with your Cassandra. The tighter you are, the more secure you're going to be, but also the more chances you have to cause unknown, unpredictable, very hard to troubleshoot and to understand issues, just because you prevent your application or your container from doing something that it does maybe only rarely and that you haven't predicted, right? So the balance there is pretty tricky. And I think that containers give us a great opportunity to do this better, because the beauty of containers is that you don't have anymore, like to run Apache on a virtual machine, you need to run another 50 processes just to have the operating system up and running, while when you're running Apache or nginx in a container, you have one process. It's version because it's on a repo, like for example on the Docker Hub, with a specific version number that is a hash. And if you do a modification to that container, there's a new version, so you have a nicely versioned set of the different releases of your application that is in a same place that is the same for everybody, right? So and you only have that inside the package. So the combination of that, in my opinion, with tools like Sysdig and Falco that can tell you at a single system call level in the long term what such a container does, in my opinion, creates a beautiful and very powerful combination that, as an open source community, we have just started exploring, and that I'm very excited to work on, and I'm surely going to invest quite a bit of time in the future on that.
That's cool. Yeah, John, I'll throw it over to you.
Yeah. So the one last one, and this is, you guys must have run into this in the past with Wireshark as well. The thing with containers, when you've got all these containers that are having, as you're just talking about, a single process and like very tight microservices, but now imagine you've got 10,000 of them.
Mm-hmm.
Anything you want to share about how do you deal with that volume of logs and all that data coming off those, and how do you keep sane? I mean, I think Mike was close before when he mentioned talking about filtering, but how do you guys look at making that manageable?
Yeah, one thing that I often say is the transition from physical monolithic servers to cloud computing is often described with the metaphor moving from pets to cattle, right? So instead of having few pets that you really take care of and you really care and you invest all of your time on them, you have like instances behind the load balancer and you treat them as a group instead of like a single individual that you care about specifically, And I typically bring this metaphor to a new level when talking about containers, especially orchestrated containers. To me, orchestrated containers is like moving from cattle to a swarm of locusts. Like you have millions of them that move very quickly, are all over the place. They're tiny, but if you don't treat them in the proper way, if you're not careful, they can do a lot of damage, right? And the whole stack needs to be rethought, because it at the surface it just looks like it's just a matter of numbers, right? You just need to make things more scalable. You just need to be prepared to consume more information because you have more entities and so on. In practice, it's really like a philosophical change. So, for example, with Falco, one of the things that is very unique with Falco, as I was saying before, is it's integrated with APIs. For example, the AWS APIs or the Kubernetes APIs. So with Falco, you can specify a rule. For example, I don't want anybody to read this sensitive file, but only in my production environment, because I want to give people a bit more freedom in my dev environment, to operate. Or I want this, Redis sandbox rule to be applied only to the Redis instances that are part of my credit card validation service, and not to the Redis instances that are part of my mapping service, or something like that. And how do you do that? You do that by treating things at the logical level. So cluster, namespace, service, for example, in Kubernetes, or any label or logical, meaning that the user gives to these containers, instead of applying these rules to specific containers. And you do that by essentially tight integration, not only with the operating system to collect the data, but with the orchestrator, which is a little bit of the cloud operating system, to make sense of this data and understand, okay, these I have two Redis containers running on the same machine, but I need to apply two different set of rules to them, and I need to apply two different reporting policies to them, because logically, even if they are the same Redis container in the same version, logically for me, they mean two different things. And that's how you approach the locusts versus the cattle.
Cool. Matt?
Awesome. Loris, grazie. Thank you for joining us on Application Security Weekly.
Prego. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure, and talk to you soon.
If anyone wants to learn more about Falco, please visit sysdig.com/open source/Falco. I also believe the other open source tools are under that base open source directory as well. We'll take a quick break and then cover the news for this week.